Hello. Last time we posed the question of what kind of man would the American people elect to solve this economic crisis. We had mentioned the fact that Germany turned to a dictator by the name of Adolf Hitler, and Italy turned to someone named Mussolini, and Europe was having a hard time dealing with the Great Depression. What would America do? What kind of person would be elected in 1932? And with that, I'm going to introduce you to the figure of FDR, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt. What type of a person was he? Well, he was born into privilege. He had 16 he was a descendant of people that came over from the Mayflower. He was a fifth cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, and he was born into a life of privilege. He went to private school, and he received the best education, and he was a very outstanding, very capable person. And one of the notable things about him was in 1921 he was struck with polio, which is a crippling disease. It left him unable to move his legs, and he was confined for the later half of his life to a wheelchair. And that is a major issue. How do people look at someone in a wheelchair? Do people look at them as being somehow disabled or incapable of leading the country, or would the American people look past something like that? And the answer is FDR. I think this really acted as a catalyst to forge his character as an eternal optimist. And when people looked at FDR, when people saw him, he was always smiling. He was always speaking very positively. His this disability gave him eventually the strength to decide what type of a person he would be. He could he could be bitter, he could be a defeatist, but he decided to become an optimist. And it was just this type of person that was the American people wanted to turn to for an answer during this economic crisis. They wanted an optimist. And that's the type of person that he was. The election of 1932 came, and FDR promised what he called a New Deal for the American people. And so his presidency, which will end up lasting for 4 terms, is called the New Deal. And his campaign promise was pretty much this: we are going to try something. We're going to try something. We're going to try anything. If that doesn't work, we're going to try something else. If that doesn't work, we're going to try something else. But the government is going to try something, is going to try anything to get us out of the Great Depression. He was a little vague on what he wanted to do exactly, but he projected an image of confidence that the government is willing to try something. Whereas Hoover, of course, was not as warm as FDR was, and again, he was reluctant to give direct aid. I want to mention an incident that happened right before the election in 1932 that was called the Bonus Army Incident. There were about 20,000 World War I veterans who were promised a bonus for serving in the war, for serving in the army during that time. They were promised a bonus, but the bonus was not due until 1945. And here it is 1932. These veterans have fallen on hard times, like so many others, and they wanted their bonus now. They needed their money now. And so what they did essentially was they marched on Washington. And they wanted to try to petition the government to pass a law that would give them their bonus now. Well, Congress voted. There was a measure in Congress, and eventually it was voted down, and to the disappointment of this bonus army. And they were asked to leave, and they literally had camped right outside of the Capitol building, and they were told to vacate the premises. And some police were called in. There was a skirmish that developed into a riot, and eventually the army was called in. And here comes the army with tear gas, with bayonets, with they even had a machine gun detachment. And this whole operation was led by a man named Douglas MacArthur, who eventually became a hero of World War II in the Pacific. And the bottom line was, this was really a distasteful act. A lot of people identified with the veterans, with the World War I veterans, and this really looked bad for President Hoover. And after this incident, it was almost a foregone conclusion that Hoover would not be reelected, that FDR would definitely win, which he did by a landslide. During FDR's inaugural speech, he will deliver one of his most famous lines that really kind of sums up his first term in office. And that line is, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And what Roosevelt wanted to do was, he wanted to restore America's confidence in the system, in the banks, in everything else. He wanted to avoid this panic that had led to a lot of the banks closing and other such things. Roosevelt's first few months in office was known as the 100 days. And this was a time when he was able to pass 15 pieces of legislation, which is a phenomenal thing. 100 days, 15 laws were passed. Of course, both the House and the Senate were largely Democrats, and they were willing to do whatever he wanted to do to solve this crisis. They didn't want to do the usual feet dragging and the bickering and the compromising. They wanted to get on board with whatever FDR wanted to do. And so this time was known as the 100 days. One of the major issues that FDR needed to address was the banking system. How do we get people to put their money back into a bank? Even those that had jobs, they remembered a few years ago that they had money in the bank, and more often than not, they went to the bank and it wasn't there. The banks had lent it out, and people had lost that money in the stock market. So people did not have a great amount of confidence in the banks. But what we needed to do, what the country needed to do to stimulate the economy, is to get people to be comfortable enough to put their money back into the banks. The banks could then lend it out to businesses and other things, and the businesses could hire people, and they felt that they could really improve the economy by doing that. So one of the things that he did was he passed a series of laws that helped the banks. So one of the laws was the Glass-Steagall Act, which guaranteed bank deposits up to $5,000. So if you deposited money in the bank, that money would be guaranteed. You could go and get it anytime you wanted. That money was guaranteed to be there. Even if there was a run on the bank or anything else, that money was guaranteed. There would be a system that would get that money from another bank, and you would be guaranteed that money was safe. And one of the he also passed several other banking measures as well to solidify the banks, to help people's confidence in the banks, and to prevent banks from going out of business. One of the crucial things that FDR did during this whole time was he had something called the fireside chat. And this was when he would actually get on the radio, and keep in mind, the radio was a new piece of technology. Politicians weren't really using it that much at this time. It was brand new. It would be like maybe doing a web chat or something like that. Like if the president did a web chat today, that would be a relatively new thing. So just as the radio was a new thing to communicate to the American people, he wanted to talk directly to the American public as a whole, and this was really not done before this time. And so what he did was he got on the radio and he had what were called fireside chats, and in a very warm and confident voice he explained in plain English what he